In the pouring rain, a millionaire unexpectedly met a skinny girl with only one arm, holding a newborn baby tightly in her arms. The girl looked up, her eyes filled with pain and a silent cry for help. He could not have imagined that this very meeting would change the lives of all three of them forever. The rain came down in relentless sheets, hammering the asphalt with a ferocity that muted the usual hum of the city. Gabriel strode down the empty street, his polished leather shoes sending ripples through shallow pools of water. His tailored coat clung to him in the damp air, doing little to shield him from the chill that seemed to seep beneath the fabric. A well-groomed man in his late 30s, Gabriel moved with purpose, yet his eyes carried a heaviness that contradicted the briskness of his stride. Wealth clung to him like the faint scent of his cologne, but it did nothing to soften the edges of the solitude etched into his face. The streets were barren, their usual bustle surrendered to the storm. Even the neon signs above the shops flickered weakly, their defiance fading under the relentless downpour. Gabriel's hand tightened around the strap of his leather briefcase. The weight of it was familiar, grounding, though the papers inside hardly mattered tonight. This wasn't his usual walk, a detour from routine, compelled by nothing more than the desire to escape the confines of his cavernous, too quiet home. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it almost blended with the rhythm of the rain. A cry. He stopped, instinct sharpening against the monotony of the storm. The sound came again, more distinct this time, thin and desperate. Gabriel scanned the darkened street, the rain blurring his vision. It took a moment before he spotted it, a huddled figure beneath a twisted, leafless tree near the edge of the sidewalk. As he approached, the details sharpened. A girl, no older than 12, crouched with her back to the tree, her arms wrapped tightly around a bundled shape. Her hair was plastered to her pale face, and her clothes hung from her slight frame, soaked through and threadbare. The bundle in her arms shifted. A baby. Gabriel slowed, holding his hands out slightly, in an attempt to appear less imposing. "Hey," he called, his voice low but firm, careful not to startle her. "Are you all right?" The girl's head snapped up. Her dark eyes locked onto him, wide, with a mix of fear and defiance. She shrank further into herself, clutching the baby tighter. "Stay back," she said, her voice trembling, but laced with an edge that didn't belong to someone her age. Gabriel froze, his hands still raised. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The rain pounded against his shoulders, but he didn't move closer. "You're going to get sick out here. Both of you." Her gaze darted between him and the street behind him, her breath shallow and rapid. "We don't need your help." Gabriel hesitated, reading the desperation in her posture. It wasn't just the rain or the cold, it was the kind of wariness that came from too many broken promises. Too many times trust had led to betrayal. He took a cautious step back, creating more space between them. "All right," he said, "but at least let me get the baby out of the rain. My house is nearby. It's warm and there's food." He paused, letting his words settle before adding, "You can leave whenever you want. No one will stop you." The girl's grip on the bundle tightened, and Gabriel noticed the tremor in her hands. The baby whimpered softly, its small, muffled cry barely audible over the storm. The girl's shoulders sagged under the weight of her exhaustion, though her eyes never left him. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a small, reluctant nod. Gabriel stepped forward, careful to keep his movements slow. "Can I carry him for you?" he asked, his tone gentle. The girl hesitated, her fingers twitching against the soaked fabric of the blanket. Finally, she extended the bundle toward him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her hand brushed his as she passed the baby over, her skin ice cold. Gabriel adjusted the weight in his arms, surprised by how light the child felt. He glanced at her again, noticing the way she swayed slightly on her feet. "Let's go," he said, tilting his head in the direction of his home. The girl followed, her steps uneven and slow, her wet sneakers squelching with every move. Gabriel kept his pace steady, glancing back occasionally to make sure she didn't fall too far behind. The rain showed no signs of letting up, but the warm glow of his house's windows came into view in the distance, a beacon against the storm. As they approached, Gabriel felt the weight of the moment settle on him. This wasn't just about sheltering two strangers for the night. It was about something deeper, an unspoken connection forged in the storm, one that whispered of lives intersecting for reasons neither of them could yet understand. The girl lingered on the threshold as Gabriel unlocked the door. He turned to her, his expression calm but expectant. "You're safe here," he said simply. Deborah glanced at him, then at the baby in his arms. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded, not with trust, but with the exhaustion of someone who had no choice but to believe, at least for tonight. The heavy door closed with a soft thud, cutting off the roar of the storm. Inside, the quiet was almost startling, save for the faint hum of the central heating and the occasional crackle of rain against the windows. Gabriel set the baby down gently on the plush leather sofa, careful not to disturb him further. The room, spacious and tastefully furnished, seemed to swallow the sound of his footsteps as he moved toward the girl still standing near the doorway. Deborah didn't follow. She hovered just inside, her sneakers dripping onto the polished hardwood floor. Her eyes darted from the chandelier, casting a warm glow over the room, to the sleek black piano in the corner, her expression veiled in suspicion. "You can sit," Gabriel said, gesturing toward the couch. His voice was low, calm, as though speaking too loudly might scare her off. Deborah didn't respond. Instead, she clutched her jacket tighter around her thin frame, as if it could protect her from more than the cold. Gabriel didn't press. He moved to the kitchen, which opened seamlessly into the living room, separated only by a marble island. The clinking of glass and the faint rush of water filled the air as he prepared 2 mugs of tea. The scent of chamomile drifted through the room, soft and inviting. When he returned, she hadn't moved. Gabriel hesitated for a moment, then placed one of the steaming mugs on the coffee table within her reach. "For you. It's warm." Deborah's gaze flicked to the mug, then back to him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice sharp, her posture rigid. Gabriel leaned back slightly, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "Because you need help," he said simply. She didn't look convinced. Her fingers twitched at her sides, the tension in her frame palpable. Gabriel let the silence hang between them, not pushing, not filling the space with empty reassurances. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Deborah's attention snapped to him immediately. She crossed the room in quick, cautious steps, crouching beside the sofa. Her movements, though swift, had a careful precision, one arm adjusting the edge of the blanket around the baby, while the other hovered protectively over him. Gabriel noticed then, for the first time, how her right sleeve sagged unnaturally, the fabric bunched as though hiding something. His eyes lingered, but he said nothing. Instead, he moved to the thermostat and adjusted the temperature, letting the hum of the heater grow slightly louder. "Do you live here alone?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Yes," Gabriel replied, returning to his seat across from her. He didn't elaborate, but the words seemed to echo in the vast space, reinforcing the emptiness around them. Deborah didn't press further. Her gaze flitted back to Juan, her hand brushing lightly over his cheek. "He's all I have," she murmured, almost to herself. Gabriel caught the words, the weight in them. He nodded toward the sofa. "He's lucky to have you." She didn't respond. Instead, she shifted slightly, leaning against the arm of the sofa, her thin shoulders slumping as exhaustion began to overtake her. Her damp jacket clung to her, the water soaking into the cushion beneath her. "You need to change," Gabriel said gently. "I can get you something dry." Deborah tensed, her eyes narrowing. "I'm fine." Gabriel raised his hands in a placating gesture. "All right, but you're dripping water everywhere. At least let me give you a towel." Her gaze lingered on him for a long moment, weighing his words, before she gave a small, reluctant nod. He disappeared down the hall, returning with a soft towel and a blanket. He set them beside her, stepping back to give her space. "The bathroom's down the hall. First door on the left," he offered. Deborah hesitated, then rose slowly. She took the towel, but left the blanket behind. As she walked away, Gabriel's eyes followed her, noting the stiffness in her movements, the slight limp in her step. When she was gone, he turned his attention to the baby. Juan's chest rose and fell in soft, even breaths. He adjusted the blanket around the tiny figure, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric. Deborah returned minutes later, her damp jacket replaced by a dry, oversized sweatshirt Gabriel had left in the bathroom. The sleeves hung far past her hands, and the hem fell nearly to her knees. She didn't meet his gaze as she sat back down, but she looked marginally less guarded. "We used to have a garden," she said suddenly, her voice quiet, almost tentative. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the sweatshirt. "It was big. My mum used to grow flowers there." Gabriel didn't respond immediately. He watched her carefully, the way her eyes flickered with something distant and fragile. "What happened to it?" he asked softly. Deborah's hands stilled. Her shoulders tightened slightly, the moment of openness fading as quickly as it had come. "It's gone," she said flatly. Gabriel leaned back, his gaze steady but unobtrusive. He didn't press her, didn't ask for more. Instead, he reached for his own mug, sipping the tea that had gone lukewarm. As the storm raged on outside, Gabriel realized how deeply the scars of her past ran. He vowed silently, without knowing why, that he would uncover the truth, not just for her, but for himself. Gabriel sat on the armchair near the fireplace, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across the room. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was a quiet tension, as though the house itself held its breath. Deborah was seated on the edge of the sofa, her small frame dwarfed by its size. She kept a protective hand on the bundle next to her, Juan, who had finally drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. The warmth of the fire flushed her pale cheeks, but the guarded look in her eyes hadn't softened. Gabriel watched her for a moment, the silence heavy between them, before realizing something that made him sit up straighter. "I forgot to ask your name," he said, his voice cutting gently through the quiet. Deborah blinked, her hand pausing mid-motion where she had been smoothing the blanket over Juan. "Why does it matter?" she asked, her tone sharp, defensive. "It matters to me," Gabriel said simply, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He kept his gaze steady, but unintrusive. "You're here, in my home. I'd like to know who I'm helping." She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, after a long pause, she muttered, "Deborah." Her eyes flicked to him, as if daring him to ask more. "And him?" Gabriel nodded toward the baby. "Juan." Her hand returned to the bundle, smoothing the blanket again as though the movement could shield them both from further questions. Gabriel leaned back slightly, letting the firelight warm his face. He repeated their names in his mind, Deborah and Juan. They felt too small, too fragile, for the enormity of whatever burden they carried. Deborah's gaze drifted to the flames, her posture softening just slightly. For the first time, Gabriel noticed how young she looked, despite the weight she carried in her expression. Her guarded demeanor was tempered by a battle weariness that no child should ever experience. As the silence stretched on, her eyes unfocused, and her body seemed to relax almost imperceptibly. The tension in her shoulders eased, and her breaths slowed, her mind wandering somewhere far from the warmth of the room. Gabriel didn't interrupt. He watched as her fingers traced invisible patterns on the edge of the sofa, her lips parting slightly, as though the words she wasn't ready to say might escape. "I remember flowers," she said suddenly, her voice low, distant. Gabriel didn't move, afraid that any shift might break the moment. "We had a garden. My mum used to grow roses, red ones mostly, but there were other colors too." Deborah's fingers paused, her hand tightening into a fist. "I used to help her water them. She always said flowers made a house feel alive." There was a pause, a deep breath, and then her voice hardened. "But they're gone now. Everything's gone." The way she said it, sharp, final, made it clear she wouldn't explain further. Gabriel wanted to ask, to understand what had happened, but the vulnerability in her tone stopped him. He glanced at Juan, whose tiny form rose and fell with each soft breath. His face, serene and unmarked by the weight Deborah carried, made Gabriel's chest tighten. He thought of the empty rooms upstairs, the spaces in his house that had never known the chaos of children's laughter or the warmth of a family. "You're good with him," Gabriel said softly, breaking the silence. Deborah turned to him, her expression guarded again. "He's all I have," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken earlier. "And you're doing a good job," Gabriel added, his tone genuine. She stared at him for a moment, as if searching for any trace of insincerity before looking away. "It doesn't feel like it," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Gabriel opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he saw the faint tremor in her hands. She was trying so hard to hold it together, but even in the firelight, her exhaustion was evident. The quiet stretched again, broken only by the occasional pop of the fire. Deborah's eyes began to flutter closed, her body swaying slightly. "Why don't you rest?" Gabriel suggested, keeping his voice low. "I can't," she murmured, though her resistance sounded weak. "If something happens to him—" "Nothing will happen," Gabriel said, his voice steady. "You're safe here. He's safe here." Deborah hesitated, but her body betrayed her, sagging against the sofa. Within moments, her head tilted forward and she was asleep. Gabriel rose slowly, careful not to disturb either of them. He retrieved a blanket from the back of a chair and draped it gently over Deborah's small frame. As he stepped back, her face, softened in sleep, looked younger than ever. Then, her voice pierced the silence, barely audible above a whisper. "Logan." Gabriel froze, the name hovering in the air like a shadow. It was the first crack in the wall around her story, and it filled him with a sense of dread he couldn't yet place. He returned to his chair, his thoughts racing. Whatever the name meant, whatever it was tied to, Gabriel knew one thing. It was the key to understanding the scars that ran so deep in the girl now sleeping before him. Gabriel sat in his study the next morning, the house bathed in an uneasy quiet. Deborah and Juan were still asleep in the living room, the fire now reduced to embers. He couldn't shake the name from his mind. Logan. It echoed in his thoughts like a warning. He powered on his laptop, the familiar glow casting shadows across the dark wood desk. Typing Logan into a search bar felt almost ridiculous, too vague, too broad. The results were endless and useless. Real estate listings, legal firms, random social media profiles. He leaned back in frustration, rubbing his temple. Subconsciously, he incorporated industries into the search. A list of articles popped up, and Gabriel's eyes narrowed as he scrolled. Logan, Industries CEO, denies allegations of corruption. Charity or cover-up? Logan Industries ties to orphanages under scrutiny. Children go missing. Logan Industries' dark secret. The headlines punched through his initial haze of uncertainty. He clicked the first link, skimming quickly. Words like embezzlement, bribes, and abuse of power jumped out at him, painting a picture of a corporation cloaked in wealth and secrecy. Gabriel's stomach churned. He hadn't expected anything good tied to that whispered name. But this, it was worse than he imagined. The sound of a spoon clinking against ceramic pulled Gabriel out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Deborah standing in the kitchen, one hand awkwardly cradling a cup of tea, the other tucked against her side beneath the oversized sweatshirt. "You're up," he said, closing his laptop quickly. She nodded, her expression wary. "Where's Juan?" "Still sleeping." Gabriel gestured toward the sofa in the next room. Deborah hesitated, her gaze flicking to the laptop for a brief moment before she lowered herself carefully onto a stool by the counter. Gabriel noticed the faint tightness in her jaw, the way she avoided meeting his eyes. He cleared his throat. "Can I ask you something?" Her hand froze mid-stir, but she didn't respond. "Last night," Gabriel continued, choosing his words carefully, "you said a name. Logan. Does that mean anything to you?" Deborah stiffened. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she set the spoon down, the quiet clink louder than it should have been. "I don't know," she said too quickly. "I don't remember saying that." Gabriel leaned forward slightly, softening his tone. "Deborah, I'm not trying to push, but if there's something you're running from or someone—" "I'm not running," she snapped, her voice sharper than before. I don't know who Logan is." Gabriel recognized the lie instantly, the way her shoulders hunched and her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. He didn't press further. Not yet. Gabriel called in a favor. Being a millionaire, he had a vast network of connections, and discretion came naturally to him. Within hours, a trusted private investigator, Ethan Carver, sent over a file on Logan Industries. Gabriel sat alone in his study, the house quiet, except for the distant hum of the central heating. He opened the file, his heart heavy with unease. The documents laid bare a web of corruption. Logan Industries was tied to a network of orphanages across multiple cities, facilities that had been repeatedly accused of neglect and abuse. Bribes had kept the allegations buried, but whispers of missing children had persisted for years. One orphanage in particular stood out, West Haven Home for Children. The name appeared multiple times, flagged in complaints and investigations that had mysteriously gone cold. Gabriel stared at the grainy photo of the building, a squat grey structure with barred windows and a rusted gate. He could almost feel the weight of its walls, the way they seemed to hold secrets no one wanted to unearth. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Deborah's guardedness made more sense now. Whatever had happened to her and Juan, it was tied to this, to Logan. Gabriel closed the file, his hands resting on the leather-bound cover. The glow of the desk lamp illuminated the faint lines of exhaustion on his face. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk, his younger self, standing beside a smiling woman holding a toddler, his late wife, his daughter. The memories rose unbidden, like ghosts. His wealth had come at a cost, a relentless pursuit of success that had left him blind to what truly mattered. When his daughter went missing years ago, he searched for her with every means possible, his grief compounded by guilt. He hadn't been there. He had failed. Now, staring at the information in front of him, he felt that same gnawing ache in his chest. Deborah and Juan's presence in his home wasn't just chance. It was a chance. a chance to do something right. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Gabriel's resolve hardened. He needed to know more. The pieces didn't fit yet, but West Haven was a start. He rose from his chair, the file tucked under his arm. Stepping quietly into the living room, he found Deborah sitting by the window, her silhouette framed by the glow of the streetlights outside. She turned when she heard him, her expression unreadable. "I'm going to help you," Gabriel said, his voice firm but quiet. Deborah stared at him for a long moment before looking away, her fingers tightening on the windowsill. In the silence that followed, Gabriel felt the weight of what lay ahead. But for the first time in years, he also felt something else. Purpose. The morning sunlight seeped through the tall windows of Gabriel's study, casting muted golden streaks across the polished desk. He leaned over the file on Logan Industries, the papers spread in an orderly chaos. Every headline, every grainy photograph of children peeking through barred windows, every financial report screamed the same thing: exploitation hidden under the guise of charity. He glanced up, startled by the sound of light footsteps. Deborah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze sharp and distrustful. Her eyes flicked to the open file on the desk before settling on him. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone cutting. Gabriel straightened, his hand moving instinctively to close the file. "It's nothing," he began, but the words felt hollow even as he said them. Deborah stepped further into the room, her movements rigid, deliberate. "That doesn't look like nothing," she said, her voice rising. "You're looking into Logan, aren't you?" Gabriel opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off, her words spilling out like a dam breaking. "You don't care about us, do you? You just want to dig into my life, to use me, like everyone else." Her outburst was a sharp contrast to the quiet, guarded girl he'd been trying to reach. The anger in her voice was laced with something deeper: fear. She turned abruptly, scooping up Juan, who had been sitting on the sofa in the adjacent room, babbling softly to himself. "Deborah, wait," Gabriel called, stepping toward her. She spun around, clutching the baby tightly, her eyes blazing. "No! I knew it. You're no different. You're just some rich guy who thinks he can fix everything by throwing money around. You don't know what it's like. What we've been through." The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow, but Gabriel held his ground. "You're right," he said softly, his tone steady but laden with emotion. "I don't know, but I want to." She paused at the doorway, her shoulders tense, ready to flee. Gabriel stepped back, his hands raised as if surrendering. "I lost my daughter," he said, the words heavy, raw. "Years ago. When it mattered most, I didn't support him. I was too busy, too caught up in my own world to see what I was losing." Deborah froze, her grip on Juan loosening slightly. Gabriel continued, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I've spent every day since wishing I could go back and do things differently. I can't fix what I did or didn't do for him. But when I see you, Deborah, when I see Juan, I see a chance to do something right." The tension in the room shifted, a fragile truce forming in the silence that followed. Deborah's expression faltered, the sharpness in her eyes giving way to something more uncertain. She stepped back into the room, still holding Juan, her voice quieter now. "Logan," she said, the name hanging in the air like a specter. "He came to the orphanage sometimes. Everyone was terrified of him. He had this smile, like he already owned you." Her voice wavered, but she pushed on. "He didn't care about the kids. We were just, tools, numbers. And if you messed up, he made sure you paid for it." Gabriel felt his chest tighten at the quiet fury in her words. He didn't press her further, knowing she was offering him more than she had anyone else. "How did you get out?" he asked softly. Deborah hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "I ran," she said finally. "One night, when they weren't watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I thought if I could just get away, I'd figure it out. But then I found Juan." Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the baby in her arms. "I couldn't leave him behind." Gabriel nodded, his throat tight. "You were brave," he said quietly. Deborah gazed up at him, her eyes scrutinizing his face as if seeking the hidden truth. But there was none. She sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing Juan's hair. "You don't know what you're getting into," she said after a long pause. "Logan. He's not just some businessman. He has people. People who make problems disappear." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of him," he said firmly. Deborah answered, her voice barely audible above a whisper. That night, after Deborah had retreated to the guest room with Juan, Gabriel returned to his study. He opened the file again, his eyes drawn to the name West Haven Home for Children. As he flipped through the pages, a single line in an old police report caught his eye: suspected connections to the disappearance of several children, including Anna Harris. Gabriel froze. The air seemed to thicken around him as the words sank in. His daughter's name, buried in a report about Logan Industries. The connection was no longer vague. It was personal. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, the file trembling slightly in his hands. Whatever it took, whatever the risk, he was going to find the truth. Gabriel's study transformed into a battlefield. Over the following days, papers and photographs sprawled across the desk like the fractured pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The connection between Logan Industries and the orphanages was undeniable. But the deeper Gabriel delved, the darker the picture became. Ethan, his trusted private investigator, diligently labored. Gabriel's wealth unlocked hidden records, silenced testimonies, and whispers of those who had disappeared. The name West Haven Home for Children resurfaced frequently, linking Logan Industries to a disturbing trend: the disappearance of vulnerable children who had seemingly vanished from sight. Late one night, Gabriel sat hunched over a stack of records. A grim-faced Ethan stood nearby, flipping through a dossier. "These orphanages, they weren't just neglected," Ethan said, his voice low. "They were pipelines. Children funneled out for labor, some sold to God knows where." Gabriel clenched his jaw. "And Logan?" Ethan nodded grimly. "Every trail leads back to him. The man's untouchable. Bribes, intimidation, maybe worse. He's got the system rigged." Gabriel's fingers tightened around a photograph, an image of the West Haven orphanage, its barred windows looming like a prison. He felt the weight of the past pressing against his chest. Deborah's presence in the house began to change. Slowly, the frostiness in her interactions began to thaw. She began watching Gabriel as he worked, occasionally asking questions about his investigations, though always keeping Juan close. "Listen up to here, then leave a sign of your attention." A comment. Candy would be a good idea. Guess who is the most focused? One evening, as Gabriel sat reviewing yet another document, Deborah approached hesitantly. Juan was in his arms, his small fingers gripping Gabriel's shirt as he babbled softly. "You're good with him," Deborah said, the words halting, as though she was unused to giving compliments. Gabriel glanced up, startled. "He's a good kid," he said simply, smiling at the boy who had dozed off against his chest. "You've done an incredible job taking care of him." Deborah shrugged, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of relief at his words. She lingered near the desk, her fingers brushing over the papers absent-mindedly. "I couldn't save them," she said suddenly, her voice tight. Gabriel looked at her, waiting for her to continue. "At the orphanage, she explained, her hands trembling slightly. There were other kids, younger than me, weaker. I told myself I'd find a way to help them. But when the chance came, I just ran. Her voice cracked, and Gabriel's heart ached at the guilt etched into her every word. You did what you had to, he said gently. You saved Juan. That's not nothing. Deborah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed like she might argue, but instead she nodded, the smallest crack in her armor revealing itself. Gabriel's investigation led him to survivors of the orphanages, those who had escaped or been abandoned when the operations shut down. Each story painted a clearer, more horrifying picture. There were trucks, one man, now in his 20s, recounted over the phone. His voice was shaky, even years later. They'd show up in the middle of the night. Kids would be loaded on, and that was it. We never saw them again. Another survivor, a woman in her 30s, refused to speak until Gabriel paid for her relocation to an undisclosed city. I saw Logan once, she whispered. He came to inspect the place. Didn't talk to the staff, just looked at us, like we were inventory. The more Gabriel uncovered, the clearer it became. Logan wasn't just funding these operations, he was orchestrating them. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the windows, Gabriel flipped through a batch of documents Ethan had retrieved from an old West Haven storage unit. His breath caught when he saw it. Deborah's name. It was buried in a faded roster, handwritten and barely legible. Next to her name were notations. Transfer pending, followed by a scribbled-out date. Gabriel felt his hands tremble as he traced the name on the page. It was proof, solid and irrefutable. Deborah hadn't just passed through Logan's shadow, she had been ensnared in it. Gabriel stayed up that night, poring over the records again and again. As the puzzle began to come together, one question stood out above the rest. How deep does this go? He stared at a faded photo of Logan, the man's calculated smile chilling even in grainy black and white. Gabriel's grip on the page tightened as determination replaced exhaustion. Tomorrow, he would confront Deborah with what he had found, not to demand answers, but to show her that the fight wasn't hers to carry alone anymore. As the clock ticked past midnight, Gabriel glanced at the framed photo on his desk, a younger version of himself with his daughter, her laughter frozen in time. The connection between Logan and West Haven was no longer just a matter of justice. It was personal. Gabriel stood by the window of his study, the evening light fading into a dusky orange. Outside, the world seemed deceptively calm, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. His investigation had progressed from uncovering hidden truths to probing a tumultuous situation. Logan's name was no longer just a thread. It was a web, pulling tighter with every discovery. The first sign came that morning. A sleek black car idled across the street from his house, the driver's face obscured behind tinted windows. It didn't move for hours, and though the figure inside didn't step out, the message was clear. We know where you are. Gabriel hadn't mentioned it to Deborah. The progress he'd made with her trust was fragile, and she was already hypervigilant. Instead, he'd gone about his day, though his mind churned with calculations, weighing risks and strategies. It was late when he found the note. Folded neatly and left on the doorstep, the paper was damp from the cool night air, but the words were unmistakable. Stay out of this. Gabriel's hands tightened around the note, his jaw clenching as he read the words again. He could almost picture Logan's smug expression behind the veiled threat. The audacity of it only strengthened his resolve. Returning to his study, he paced the room, the note clenched in one hand. He needed allies, someone with resources and influence who could help him push back. The first name that came to mind was Brian Pierce, a longtime business partner. Brian had been a steady presence in Gabriel's life, a confidant during his most turbulent years. Gabriel picked up his phone and dialed. The next afternoon, Gabriel arrived at Brian's office, a sprawling glass-fronted building that reflected the city skyline. Brian greeted him warmly, his handshake firm and his smile wide. "Gabriel," Brian said, gesturing for him to sit. "It's been too long. What's going on? You sounded urgent." Gabriel hesitated, studying Brian's face. "I need your help," he said, lowering his voice. "I'm looking into Logan Industries." Brian's smile faltered just for a moment. "Logan Industries," he echoed, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, I found some disturbing connections. Orphanages, missing children." Gabriel leaned forward, his voice steady but intense. "I know you have contacts in their circles. If you can help me get closer to the truth—" "Gabriel," Brian interrupted, his tone soft but firm. "You're walking into dangerous territory. Logan isn't someone you investigate lightly. He's, well, protected." "That doesn't scare me," Gabriel said, his jaw tightening. "If you've heard anything, Brian, I need to know. Lives are at stake." Brian leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish here? Take down Logan? Expose him? And then what? Men like him don't fall quietly." Gabriel frowned. "This isn't about winning some moral crusade. It's about justice. It's about stopping him before more people get hurt." For a long moment, Brian didn't respond. Then he sighed, pulling a folded napkin closer and tracing its edge with his fingers. "Gabriel, I can't help you." The words hung in the air, cold and final. "You mean you won't?" Gabriel said, his voice hardening. Brian glanced away, the mask of camaraderie slipping to reveal something colder. "You don't understand how deep this runs. Logan has ties everywhere: law enforcement, politicians, even business leaders. If you keep poking around, you're not just putting yourself in danger. You're endangering everyone around you." Gabriel experienced a profound realization. "You're working with him, aren't you?" he said, his voice low but sharp. Brian's silence was more powerful than any denial. Before Gabriel could respond, the restaurant door swung open and two men entered, their movements deliberate. Gabriel recognized them immediately. Logan's men. They moved toward him with quiet precision, their presence commanding the room's attention. Gabriel's instincts screamed at him to run, but before he could act, one of them reached his side. "Mr. Harris," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of menace, "we need you to come with us." Brian stood abruptly, his expression carefully composed. "There's no need for trouble," he said smoothly. "Sit down," the second man barked, and Brian complied, his composure faltering for the first time. Gabriel's hands curled into fists under the table. "If this is about Logan, tell him I'm not backing off," he said. The first man's lips twisted into a smirk. "Oh, we'll make sure he gets the message. Let's go." Before Gabriel could protest further, they grabbed him by the arms, their grips ironclad. The other diners watched in stunned silence, their murmurs rising as Gabriel was hauled toward the exit. He shot one last look at Brian, who sat frozen, his face pale and unreadable. Betrayal cut deeper than fear as Gabriel was forced out into the waiting SUV. The door slammed shut behind him, and the vehicle sped off into the night. Gabriel's mind raced, his body tense. He didn't know where they were taking him, but one thing was clear. The hunt had turned, and now he was the prey. The study was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the central heating the only sound. Deborah had spent most of the day sitting by the window, Juan asleep in her lap, watching the empty street. Gabriel hadn't returned. By evening, unease turned into something sharper. Deborah walked into the study, her gaze immediately landing on the chaotic spread of papers and photographs across Gabriel's desk. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she stepped closer, scanning the files. The images chilled her. Photos of children in cramped orphanages, financial documents with Logan Industries' name emblazoned across the top, and police reports detailing missing kids. Deborah's name appeared on a faded roster with scribbled notes beside it. Her stomach twisted as she realized how much Gabriel had uncovered, how much he had risked to help her. A sense of guilt pressed down on her chest. She'd misjudged him, assumed he was like everyone else. But this was different. Then she spotted a folder marked Ethan Carver. Inside was a business card with the name of a detective agency and a number scrawled across it. Without hesitation, Deborah picked up the phone. "Carver Investigations," came the gruff voice on the other end. "Detective Carver?" Deborah's voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. "My name's Deborah. I think Gabriel Harris is in trouble. He didn't come back home all day." There was a pause and then, "Harris? What happened?" "He was looking into Logan Industries," Deborah said quickly. "I think Logan's people must have taken him. Yesterday he received a warning from Logan." Ethan's tone hardened. "Stay where you are. Don't open the door for anyone. I'll notify the police and come to you." Deborah hung up, her hands trembling. She looked at Juan, who had woken and was watching her with wide, curious eyes. She stroked his hair absently, her mind racing. Gabriel's head throbbed as he came to. His wrists were bound tightly behind him, the coarse rope cutting into his skin. He was seated on a cold metal chair in a dimly lit warehouse, the air thick with the scent of oil and rust. The sound of footsteps echoed, growing louder until a man stepped into the light. He was tall, with a sharply tailored suit that seemed out of place in the grimy surroundings. "Mr. Harris," the man said smoothly, his voice carrying an unsettling calm. "You've been busy." Gabriel didn't respond. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the room. Two other men stood by the door, their postures casual, but their hands resting on holstered weapons. "You should have taken the warning," the man continued, circling him slowly. "But some people, they just don't know when to stop." Gabriel glared at him. "Logan's operations won't stay hidden forever. You can't intimidate everyone." The man smirked, leaning down to meet Gabriel's gaze. "You'd be surprised how far intimidation goes." One of the guards stepped forward, delivering a hard punch to Gabriel's stomach. Pain exploded through him, and he gasped for breath, his body jerking against the restraints. "We'll make this simple," the man in the suit said, straightening. "You're going to tell us everything you found. Every file, every contact, every little piece of dirt you've been digging up." Gabriel spat blood onto the floor. "Go to hell." The man sighed, as though disappointed. "I was hoping you'd be cooperative, but no matter. We'll find your little secrets, with or without your help." Gabriel's resolve only hardened. He thought of Deborah and Juan, of the lives ruined by Logan's greed. He couldn't let them win. Back at the house, Deborah sat in the living room, the weight of the situation bearing down on her. Ethan and two officers arrived within the hour, their presence bringing a measure of reassurance, but no answers. "We'll find him," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." Deborah nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. She glanced at Juan, who clung to her silently, his wide eyes taking in the tension around him. "I can't lose him too," she whispered. Ethan didn't need to ask who else she had lost. The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. "You won't," he said, simply. Ethan Carver paced in his office, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. "Run the plates again," he barked into the receiver, his frustration barely contained. The GPS ping from Gabriel's last location had gone dark after the SUV left the restaurant. Whoever was behind this had planned well. He turned back to his desk, pulling up a map of the city on his computer. The police scanner buzzed quietly in the background, officers calling out updates as the search continued. Ethan's fingers danced across the keyboard as he cross-referenced possible locations, warehouses owned by Logan Industries and abandoned buildings near the last known location of the SUV. Ethan murmured to himself, "Logan never leaves anything unfinished." He knew the man's reputation: ruthless, calculating, and merciless. If Gabriel was still alive, it was only because Logan had a use for him. The car sped down the rain-slicked streets, its sirens cutting through the night. Deborah sat in the back seat, gripping Juan tightly as Ethan drove with a grim focus. The air inside the car was tense, thick with urgency. "You should have stayed behind," Ethan said sharply, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "This isn't a place for you or the boy." "I'm not staying behind," Deborah shot back, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "He risked everything for us. I'm not letting him face this alone." Ethan clenched his jaw, but refrained from arguing. He understood her determination, even if he didn't agree with it. The GPS pinged with their destination, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was one of several properties tied to Logan Industries and the most likely location where Gabriel was being held. Ethan's hand tightened on the wheel as he turned sharply onto a deserted road, the glow of the warehouse coming into view. "Stay in the car," Ethan said as he parked, his tone leaving no room for debate. Deborah nodded, but the moment he stepped out with the officers, she quietly opened her door. "Stay here," she whispered to Juan, placing him gently in the back seat. "I'll be right back." Juan's wide eyes followed her as she slipped out of the car, her movements silent and deliberate. She kept low, creeping toward the side of the warehouse. The sound of voices and the faint glow of lights guided her to a broken window. As she peered inside, her breath became trapped in her throat. Gabriel sat bound to a chair in the center of the room, his face bloodied but defiant. Logan stood nearby, his presence commanding, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the violence he orchestrated. Two men flanked him, their eyes cold and detached. "I gave you a chance," Logan said, his voice smooth, almost casual. "You could have walked away, but now you've made this inconvenient." Gabriel glared at him, his voice hoarse but steady. "You'll never get away with this," Logan smirked. "I already have." One of the men stepped forward, holding a hammer in his hand. Deborah's stomach churned as she realized his intent. The man grabbed Gabriel's hand, pinning it to the armrest of the chair. "Last chance," Logan said, his eyes locked on Gabriel's. "Tell me everything." Gabriel clenched his jaw, his silence his only answer. The man raised the hammer, and Deborah's scream tore through the air. "Stop!" The room froze. Logan turned toward the window, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" he said, gesturing to his men. "Bring her in." Deborah didn't wait. She climbed through the broken window, her heart pounding, and rushed to Gabriel's side. Her body shielded his as she spread her arms wide, glaring at Logan and his men. "Leave him alone," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. Logan chuckled, his amusement evident. "Brave, but foolish. You've just made things worse for both of you." The sound of shattering glass and the crash of a door bursting open interrupted him. Ethan and the police stormed in, weapons drawn. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them," one officer barked. Chaos erupted. Logan's men drew their weapons, firing at the intruders. Ethan ducked behind a stack of crates, returning fire as the officers spread out, their movements calculated and precise. Deborah crouched beside Gabriel, her hands fumbling with the ropes that bound him. "Hold still," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she worked. "Deborah, get out of here," Gabriel rasped, his voice strained. "It's not safe." "I'm not leaving you," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "Now stop talking and let me do this." A bullet ricocheted off a metal beam nearby, the sound deafening. Deborah flinched, but didn't stop. Finally the ropes fell away, and Gabriel slumped forward, his body weak but free. Logan, seeing the tide turn against him, made a break for the back door. Ethan spotted him and fired a warning shot. "Don't move, Logan." Logan froze, his hands raised, his expression dark. "You've made a mistake," he said coldly. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Ethan smirked. "You're right. But neither do you." The remaining men were subdued, handcuffed, and dragged outside as the chaos subsided. Logan and Brian, who had been found hiding in a back room, were led out in chains, their empires crumbling around them. Deborah knelt beside Gabriel, her hands pressing against the wound on his side, blood seeping through her fingers. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, don't leave." Gabriel's eyes fluttered open, his gaze locking onto hers. For a moment, he saw his daughter in her defiance, her desperation. "Anna," he murmured, his voice barely audible. She leaned closer, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here." As the paramedics rushed in, Gabriel's eyes drifted closed. The last thing he heard was Deborah's voice, calling his name like an anchor in the storm. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Gabriel lay still, his face pale against the stark white of the sheets, but his breathing was steady. The storm outside had passed, and soft morning light seeped through the blinds, casting gentle shadows across the room. Deborah sat by his side, Juan asleep in her lap. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, her face drawn with worry. She had stayed by him through the night, unwilling to leave, as though her presence could tether him to life. When Gabriel stirred, his eyes fluttering open, Deborah straightened, her heart racing. "Gabriel?" she whispered, leaning closer. He blinked, his gaze finding hers. For a moment, his expression was one of confusion, but then recognition softened his features. "Deborah," he murmured, his voice hoarse. She exhaled a shaky breath, relief flooding through her. "You're okay," she said, her voice trembling. "You scared me." Gabriel managed a faint smile, though it quickly faded. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone laced with guilt. "I didn't mean to put you through this." Deborah shook her head. "You saved us. Again. Don't apologize." There was a long pause, filled only by the steady hum of the machines. Gabriel's gaze moved to Juan, still curled against Deborah, his tiny face serene. "You've been through so much," Gabriel said softly, his eyes returning to hers. "I need to ask you something." Deborah stiffened slightly, her grip on Juan tightening. "What is it?" Gabriel hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking about what you told me, about your past, the orphanage, and then I heard you scream my name. It wasn't just desperation, it was familiar, like something I'd heard before." Deborah frowned, unsure where he was going. "I don't know how to explain it," Gabriel continued, his voice raw with emotion. "But there's something about you, about the way you speak, the way you look. It reminds me of someone I lost a long time ago." Realization began to dawn on Deborah's face, but she said nothing, her eyes wide and wary. Gabriel whispered the name Anna. "My daughter. She went missing when she was just a child, and now, after everything we've been through, I need to know." Deborah's breath hitched. "You think I'm her?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Gabriel nodded, his expression both hopeful and pained. "I don't want to push you, but I need to be sure. Would you be willing to take a DNA test?" Deborah's initial reaction was to retreat, her mind tingling with fear. What if he was wrong? Could this be yet another unfortunate turn of events? But then she looked at Gabriel, at the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability etched into every line of his face. He wasn't asking this for himself alone. He was asking for her too. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I'll do it." The test results came faster than Deborah had anticipated, each passing hour stretching longer than the last. When the envelope finally arrived, Gabriel asked her if she wanted to open it together. She agreed, her hands trembling as she took the paper from him. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the lines of text until they landed on the key phrase, 99.9% probability of a parent-child relationship. Her breath caught, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. She looked up at Gabriel, whose expression mirrored hers, shock, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. "Anna," he said, his voice breaking as he reached for her. "It's you." Deborah, or Anna, didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around him, her sobs muffled against his shoulder. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by something she hadn't dared to hope for: belonging. "I never thought I'd find you," Gabriel said, his own tears falling freely. "I thought you were gone." "I don't remember," Deborah whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I thought I didn't matter." Gabriel pulled back, his hands cupping her face as he looked at her with fierce determination. "You've always mattered. Not a day went by that I didn't think of you, that I didn't pray for a miracle. And now, here you are." Juan stirred in her lap, his sleepy eyes opening to the sight of Deborah crying. Deborah smiled through her tears, pulling him close. "It's okay, sweetheart. Everything's okay now." Gabriel reached out, his hand resting gently on Juan's head. "You're part of this family too," he said warmly. "Both of you?" That evening, as the sun set over the city, Deborah and Gabriel sat together in the hospital room, Juan nestled between them. The past still lingered, its scars not easily forgotten, but for the first time, it didn't feel insurmountable. "You have a home now," Gabriel said, his voice steady. "Both of you. A place where you'll always be safe, always loved." Deborah leaned against him, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Gabriel wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "We've got a lot to figure out, Anna," he said, using her name for the first time. "But we'll do it together." And for the first time in years, the promise of tomorrow didn't feel so far away. It felt like hope. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that made every shuffle of paper and murmur of voices feel amplified. Deborah sat beside Gabriel, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Juan played quietly with a small, stuffed bear, his presence a reminder of the fragile but resilient bond they had all formed. The judge glanced over the documents before him, his face neutral but attentive. "Mr. Harris, you are requesting legal custody of both Deborah, now confirmed as your biological daughter, and Juan, who has been under her care. Is that correct?" Gabriel nodded, his voice firm. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to provide them with a home, security, and the chance to heal." The judge's gaze softened slightly as he looked at Deborah. "And you, Ms. Harris, do you wish to remain under your father's guardianship and have Juan included in this arrangement?" Deborah hesitated, her grip on her hands tightening. She glanced at Gabriel, who offered her a small, reassuring smile. The warmth in his eyes was steady, unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "We want to stay with him." The judge nodded, scribbling something on his notes. "Based on the evidence provided and the testimony heard, I see no reason to deny this request. I hereby grant full legal custody to Mr. Harris." The gavel struck the bench, and relief washed over Deborah. Gabriel reached over, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's official," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're home." The mansion, once a cold, empty space filled only with echoes of a lonely existence, had transformed. The long dining table was now a hub of laughter and conversation, with Juan's toys scattered across the polished floors. Deborah's presence filled the halls with warmth, her laughter tentative, at first, but growing more frequent as days turned into weeks. Gabriel stood in the garden one evening, the stars beginning to peek through the twilight sky. The flowers were in full bloom, vibrant reds and yellows spilling over the carefully tended beds. Deborah approached him, Juan toddling alongside her, clutching her hand. "This place doesn't feel like the same house," she said, looking around. "It feels alive." Gabriel smiled. "That's because it finally is." They sat together on the grass, Juan settling into Deborah's lap as she wrapped an arm around him. The cool night air carried the scent of blooming jasmine, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the silence. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Deborah asked suddenly, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Gabriel turned to her, his expression soft. "Without a doubt," he said, his tone filled with certainty. "She always believed in love and resilience. And that's what brought us back together." Deborah leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her scars, but not be defined by them. They were part of her, but they no longer dictated who she could be. Juan looked up at them, his eyes wide and innocent. "Are we a family now?" he asked. Gabriel ruffled the boy's hair, his heart swelling. "Yes, Juan, we're a family." The stars above seemed brighter, the world quieter, as the three of them sat together, basking in the simple yet profound joy of belonging. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it had been transformed, woven into the fabric of a new beginning. And as they sat under the vast, open sky, the promise of love and hope felt as endless as the stars above. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.